Welcome to the Caregivers Podcast. I'm your host, Dr. Mark. We're here for another exciting episode. Our guest today is Susan Ackland. She's a psychotherapist with decades of experience helping people navigate work, identity, meaning, and suffering. For the past 10 years, she's also been caring for her mother with Alzheimer's disease while raising children, sustaining a marriage with a father-in-law with Lewy body dementia, and continuing to work. This episode is not about avoiding suffering. It's about what caregiving does to a person and how you stay intact while inside it. We are going to talk about the tipping point where caregiving stops being something you do and starts becoming who you are. Then we're going to map the stages from normal life to endless tasks to suffering settling in, and finally to collapse or recalibration. Susan, thanks so much for being here today. Susan Ackland, we're so happy you're here today joining us at the Caregivers Podcast. Welcome, and let's jump right in. You know, looking back over the last 10 years, you've had lots of reflections. When you think to what's the first mistake almost every caregiver makes in week one, and what could it potentially cost them?
That's actually kind of a hard one because it sort of took me back to I just realized how much I didn't know, right? Like how much I couldn't have seen coming. Someone says a diagnosis, right? And suddenly you're in a new category and you just don't know what it means. And there was shock too. So I think, I don't know, the mistake, not knowing, being naive.
But I mean, sometimes, it's different people process shock or the unexpected nature of things in different ways. But is there some sort of a reaction to it or a cognitive trap, if you will, that sets the stage for much higher costs down the line from your experience from having, met clients over the years and from your own perspective? Are there certain things, and now you look back at how we react to those changes that would you'd advise just don't go there. Let things unroll. You might surprise yourself how competent you are to deal with the little steps.
Then I would say realize much, much sooner that you are going to have to be your person's advocate and make no assumptions about how the healthcare system is going to help you navigate through any of it.
It's amazing how much we are called to manage that element. I mean, caregiving is not just within the funnel of the individual, it's within the spectrum of the individual and how they, for the rest of their lives, interact with the outside world. And that a big part of that will be the healthcare system. It's not just, when you think about caregiving, just that one endless to-do list, but it's also that sort of constant psychological pressure that mounts as you take on the role of caregiver. What do you think, looking back and again through the course of your career, having worked with different individuals, what can new caregivers do to sort of brace themselves so they don't fall apart under that progressive psychological strain?
So I think, and this isn't going to be anything, I don't think this is revolutionary, but you have to build capacity and in all different kinds of ways. And I think that for a lot of people, it's doing it alone. There is a loneliness to caregiving for sure, but building capacity, being able to ask for help, understanding resilience, resources, like there is so much to building capacity, but that's probably like the most important thing. And I mean that in terms of your internal capacity to manage how you care for yourself, to literally the people that you can rely on, to knowing what's out there, help seeking, like all that. Like that's the.
It seems like there are lots of things that, lots of letters in the word capacity and lots of things you need to do to actually achieve capacity. What are some of the first key moves you need to make in terms of mindset to approach what's coming so you don't get in that trap? What would you think?
I think it's interesting because you're asking a kind of a generic question, and I think everyone's situation is quite different, right? And I think it depends on who you are caregiving for. Is there a time limit to it? Is it a short-term crisis of caregiving? Is it
You're right.
like Alzheimer's is what I think of, and actually it's not my term. I read it somewhere and I just thought it was so good. It's a long, slow crisis with an ever-changing playing field. And the amount of problem solving involved, cognitive problem solving to preserve someone's dignity and their independence and their quality of life, not even independence, quality of life is better. The amount of problem solving and the ever changing, it is something new all the time. So you can never really.
Because it's not scripted, right?
It's entirely.
The furthest thing.
It's entirely unscripted. And people's image of Alzheimer's, which is someone not knowing who you are, is like the end stage. It does not describe the years and years of grumbling, cognitive decline where you are trying to figure out how do you maintain this person in this situation and how do you, and just this, like the minute problem solving. I joke sometimes like this, the tasks of caregiving are sometimes they're hilarious, right? How am I going to get this person to eat a leftover in the fridge when they when they don't see it in the fridge? I'm going to have to call them, get them to walk to the fridge, open the door, look for the leftover, talk them through putting it in the microwave, wait for them to press the button to turn it on, to heat it up, take it out, get the fork, okay? And at any moment in that series of tasks, they can muck me up by something else happens and they leave the room and they forget and I'll find the leftover in the microwave.
So you're really functioning at a level of intense granularity of every step of the task as a caregiver in those moments.
And at that point, that's what I think of as, we will talk about this later, but the doing with, not the doing for. How do I do this with the person? How do I help them? And so there's a ton of that long before you get to the place where they don't know your name or where it's advanced in that way. So the capacity building is like, I think of it like, I think there's a lot of cognitive capacity of like figuring out everything.
Absolutely. And completely different from the instant overnight caregiver, for example, when there's been some acute event which affects someone's cognitive capacity or their physical capacity, and then you need to take on the lead to getting them through that, whether it's a permanent effect or whether it's something that's short term. Your mindset may shift differently, but here you really spelled out this long runway until things potentially get to that maybe more stereotypical of, oh, no one remembers me anymore, I don't remember them, and then there's really tangible changes. But that whole lead in, and that I could see how that would, in caregiving, especially in an individual with progressive dementia over time, that you'll eventually reach a tipping point as a caregiver. And, it's initially you're doing the things that a caregiver does, but then you reach that point where you realize, like, oh my God, caregiving is who I am. Like that is now taking over things, and everything sort of gets harder after that. Have you noticed a transition in your own life from that sort of initial runway to things sort of intensifying, and then you're sort of saying, I'm not just doing this, like this is a big part of who I am now?
I think,
or maybe they're individuals who gravitate towards that realization much more quickly, and not saying that it has for you, but maybe you've seen, or in your journey, seen clear different paths that people take and where they reach that tipping point a lot sooner. And curious to know what distinguishes those two different pathways.
I was thinking when you were talking about how, like, I'm a parent, right? I'm a parent, I'm a therapist, and I'm a caregiver to my mom. So I'm a caregiver in different ways in my life forever, right? For a long, long time. And there are different roles. And I think a lot about how caregiving for my mom, how is that different than being a parent, right? And how is that different from the beginning to where we are now? There are some things that are very similar, right? As my mom has lost capacity, there's more things that become the way I was with my children. And then there's some differences, right? Even with my mom's advanced dementia, she still makes her bed in the morning, okay? Which my 9-year-old might not have, right? But in terms of identity, I think that's when there's a question when I was reviewing your questions, there's one around thinking about the things, sort of the worst parts or the things that you think about that are, and I think that in my journey anyways, it's always been clear to me that I have to be more than this, that the fear or the I have to be more than a caregiver to my mom. And that's actually probably the part that's the most terrifying, is that that could be my whole life. And
That's really
yeah, and
interesting.
it cannot be my whole life, because I just can't do that. Like that can't be my whole sense of my identity. And it isn't. And I'm lucky because I have a professional identity. I have other things in my life. If my whole life were to be caregiving my mom, I don't think I could be well and do that in that way.
And a lot of people start well and end up unwell as it takes over. But what are the checks and balances? I mean, I've heard lots of stories, and I've spoken to more and more people whereby that security net is just not there, and that all of the other identities are very vulnerable to the gravitational pull of caregiving. Yep. What makes it different for, let's say, you being able to keep those other elements distinct versus other individuals who get swallowed up by caregiving and everything falls by the wayside? Is it a mindset? Yeah. Is it your previous experiences? Yeah. Is it your professional work that informs you differently? Because I've seen individuals get completely swallowed up.
I think when I think about my process, I think you dip in and out of that sometimes, right? Like you talk about tipping points. I don't think there's one tipping point in a 10-year journey. I think there are many tipping points where you hit a wall and you think something needs to change, or I can't do this in this way anymore. So for me, I was thinking a lot about the role of work in all of this. And I think that work actually is protective for me, because work is a place I go and a thing I do that is separate, and I get to focus in and use different parts of my mind, and I get to remember that I'm a person separate from that other experience. I think my work in a way is protective, and it's also a challenge, right? Because it comes with. But I think my work makes me somebody who's very attentive to my own process. And I have been. Now, having said that, there's not a lot of space for that in this journey. And that's something that I really reflected on when I read your questions, because a part of me was like, wow, these questions are all about me. And so often in a caregiving journey, it's all about the other. It's all about the other person, right? It's all about helping my mom, in this case, to have a good life as long as we can.
At the same time, there's so much attention is now on trying to preserve some of the vital elements of the caregiver in that journey too, so they're left with some footing at the end of it, because caregiving is not always a lifelong journey. But getting back to work, do you think work has taught you to be a better caregiver?
I think being a therapist and a caregiver is kind of a blessing and a curse.
You want to tell me more about that?
Yeah. I think the blessing is that I have I have the benefit of having watched and supported other people through their caregiving journeys. Okay. So I've watched, supported, listened, helped, talked about boundaries, tried to understand boundaries, tried to look at what is personal and what is systemic, and, name those things for people, because I think that's something else that I thought about a lot when I read your questions. Was these are personal questions, but there's a systemic aspect to my experience of caregiving, right? To middle-aged women caregivers, right? To a healthcare system that doesn't have solutions, where I'm forced to, I feel like I have been every part of this journey feels like to me, in spite of, you go to get help, you try to find what you need, and it's just not there. Or no, you're figuring out what you need.
Yeah, you're building the plane while you're trying to fly it, and there is that, and this has come up before as well, where you've got that default that sort of falls back onto the caregiver. Well, you'll figure it out, right?
Right, exactly. And so the blessing part of my work, I think, is the sort of the part about. I mean, I have learned a lot over the years I know lots about chronic stress, and I know lots about burnout, and I know, my professional development and experience has given me all of that to be able to, hopefully, identify my own signs and symptoms, to be able to avoid some of the potholes. You can't avoid all of them, though. You just can't, because you're, you're so busy doing all the tasks that sometimes you lose yourself. You lose. You're just so busy doing that you don't, and then something happens, right, that reminds you that you need to, like a health crisis, or if your own, it's like something happens in your own life and you think, crap, I can't do this in this way anymore. Or that's why I was saying I think there's like all these different tipping points. I think that the harder part maybe of being, and it's just me, maybe other people would feel differently about this but as a therapist, like I think you have an acute sensitivity to other people and to other people's experience, which is wonderful. I love my mother, and I have a wonderful parent. Also part of my caregiving story too, right? Because I know that everybody's experience is not that. That's not the baseline that they're coming from. And that's a very different complexity to caregiving. But I think having that acute sensitivity is hard. The other part is managing people. There's so much managing people in this journey. Like other people that are involved in my mother's life, that I think I'm grateful that I have as much lived experience of managing difficult people, so that I can navigate all of the many relationships. People, I describe them as people who are tools to me, that I need them to get the thing that my mom needs or to get through this process. They're not exceptionally helpful, but I need them, and I have to manage the relationship in order to get to the end. And I think that being a therapist, you have encountered like a million different kinds of people, right? And difficult relationships and challenges and things like that. And I think that's given me some skills.
Well, you can imagine how a caregiver who's less experienced in some of the finer moves of managing individuals, some of their challenging personalities, when the goal is a positive outcome for the person you're caring for, that they might really be disadvantaged in that situation, or the task of caregiving is just that much more onerous. But
yeah. And knowing what your triggers are, right? Like part of being a good therapist is knowing what your stuff is and what's going to get activated by a client or a situation or a story or whatever. And that's something we all carry in all parts of our lives. And I think, I'm not saying I'm perfect at it, that I don't get activated, but I think I know some of them. And so I can sort of separate out what's happening in a situation from my own reaction. And there's been plenty of opportunity to practice that.
It becomes a skill set over time as well, you hope, because those little challenges that crop up don't seem to be going anywhere. People sometimes call caregiving a life sentence. How do you stop yourself from believing that your life is going to be over until the person you're forced to care for or have to care for moves on and dies?
That's a hard one. That's a really hard one. It's funny when you even say that, I get that there's like a sensation in my, like I can feel the feeling in my stomach of, I think that you can't think too far ahead is the answer. You just can't go there. Like I try not to go there. I try to deal with what's in my control in the present, and trying to have a life in the here and now, and recognize what that is and name those things for myself. So these are the ways I have a life in the present. I try not to spend a lot of time in the grief and loss part of what you thought a certain part of your life was going to be like, or the things that and I work really hard at trying to still have the things, use creativity and imagination and figuring and a million things to try to have the things that I want, so that I don't have to spend time, because, resentment, envy, anger, all those things really just tell us about what our needs, unmet needs, right? That's all they are. So I think if you think about it like that, I try really hard to name those things and try to figure out how I can have a piece of what I need.
Yeah, and if there is a little bit of suffering from something that maybe won't be part of what you had hoped would be part of life or the journey, you can accept that, maybe more than that, but also pass it on and let it flow through, and then refocus on the now.
And sometimes those things are also, something happens in you. I can think of a particular thing that I wasn't able to participate in and to do. And it was one of those weird, it was a big deal to me. And it was a turning point for me around, we need more help. Like there has to be more help. because
Yeah.
it's not okay to, it's like, this is something that feels really not okay.
Tell me more. What did that feel like? There's someone listening out there. We've got such a range of people on different trajectories of caregiving who tune in. And what did it feel like for you, like in that moment and in those fleeting dark times where you were really mourning not being able to do something, or having to somehow accept that something wasn't going to happen? Like, what's the experience of that?
I think it was this, there was anger and powerlessness, both those things together. And because, and I think, and I think it was that this is the time in my life when and I think when we start to say shoulds, well, that's a problem, right? This is a time in my life when I should have been able to do X, and I missed out on something really important. And it was just sad and depressing. And I thought, but it galvanized me into action. Like, it made me think, okay, like, this isn't healthy. Like, I need to figure something out. I need to, we need to widen the circle of support to try to facilitate this, because I don't think this was good for me, and more of it is not going to be good.
And it takes strength to galvanize. I think about steel reinforcements of someone's skill set or toolbox. What if we don't have that skill to galvanize? Does powerlessness lead to helplessness, or a sense of helplessness?
See, the antidote to powerlessness is choice, right? Making choices, taking action. And for some people, that's the part that's really hard for them. When I think about it, it's really hard for them to see themselves able to do that. When I think about people's personal stories, their histories and their caregiving journeys, like, you bring whatever strategies you used to survive in your family, to live through that, whether or not that was people pleasing or being small or avoiding conflict or taking too much responsibility or setting no boundaries or too many boundaries. You carry all that into your caregiving relationship, right? And
like
into
most relationships, right?
Into all relationships,
exactly.
into your workplace, into your family relationships, your friendships. Like, it's all there. But I guess what I'm saying is, so someone's ability to galvanize themselves into action is going to relate to all of that, right? Not just. But when you are exhausted, like, I can think this, I fell prey to this, I think, particularly in the period, like, my kids are young adults now, but they were, like, it was a busy parenting time, and there's just so many tasks to do with work, home, kids, my mom, that you can get into, like, my image is always that, like, life can be like Wampa-Mole. You're just trying to do this all the time.
That
when
game with them. Yeah, I remember that.
Yes, exactly. And you get into doing mode, which is not thinking mode. And I think at some of those periods, that's when I've lost, like, I haven't had the energy. And this is where I have tons of empathy for people who have difficulty finding ways to take action, is you just get exhausted, literally exhausted from, like, attention exhaustion. First of all, switching all the time between task to task. Maybe we'll talk later about work disruption, what that's like when you're a caregiver.
Well described.
Yes. But I think you can get so tired that you just don't have, like, the idea of trying to figure something out even to do for yourself. Like, people talk about self-care, right? You have to have some energy for self-care.
Yeah.
Or some space.
Some energy left to even, look after your partner and be there for your partner in the way they need you. And, you can't live as a caregiver in isolation. And there's always the concern of the marital strain that comes with caregiving as well.
Absolutely. And that can be either a protective factor or a vulnerability.
Susan, caregiving seems to follow a pattern, and the more I learn about it, the more I sort of see it. You sort of start in normal life, and then it becomes endless tasks, as you alluded to earlier, that sort of hit the mole game where you're just trying to do everything, where you get to that tipping point, and then potentially it becomes your identity. And I think individuals are really vulnerable in some instances to that happening. Others may have certain strengths which allow them to navigate that risky time, but then ultimately, suffering can settle over everything, and there's that potential moment of collapse or recalibration. So, was there a recalibration event, or does that journey, that sort of path that I'm describing, does that apply to your journey as well?
Yes, I think that because it's such a long, slow decline, I feel like the tipping points, I can think of different tipping points where I feel like I hit the wall and then something had to change. Um, I think the combination, like very recently, actually, my primary support person had overnight was unavailable. So we went from like a person who was in this journey with me to literally in 24 hours, they were unavailable and entirely. And we, didn't have a lot of support. And this is quite recently.
Mm-hmm.
Uh, and suddenly, the part that really hit me in that moment was like cognitively, I always knew it was kind of like a house of cards. Like we were in this situation where I used to sort of think, oh, if something happened to them, something happened to me, like where would this all go, right?
Mm-hmm.
Well, something happened. And it revealed to me how vulnerable we were.
Mm-hmm. Oh, it's not
How
just a plug
vulnerable.
to hole you. It's actually a nurtured relationship that's built on trust, consistency, and
Yeah. And
deliverables. Right?
how vulnerable we were in the process, and how little there was between us and everything falling apart.
And how have you dealt with that?
Well, it was a really hard time. Like it was very difficult. And again, I think it resulted in, I got to figure this out. Like we need more help. I can't, like, short term and long term. And actually, I should say that is probably one of the biggest challenges is how do you caregive for someone where the enormous number of things there are to do, like I made a list, it's endless, and plan for the long term future and plan for the short term future. Like it's insane. And it's the reason why sometimes things get away from you because you literally can't do it all and work.
And is that the future, when you say that the short-term and long-term future, is that of the care recipient or your own as the caregiver in your own other relationships with your children, your partner, your workplace?
No, I mean, short term, like when you're caring for someone and it's just you, and then maybe you're putting things in place to support you in the short term, but in the long term, there's going to need to be a bigger solution
Mm-hmm.
of something, that eventually this Band-Aid solution approach isn't going to work, and you need to have some backup plans when you can no longer maybe maintain the person where they are or do things like that. And that process of the help-seeking process, finding people, finding supports, putting things in place short term is excruciating amounts of work for sometimes almost no gain. That could be another story about that. But and then the long-term picture. What about when you can no longer do this? What about when the person, you can't maintain them where they are? So I guess what I'm saying is that moment recently where suddenly it was like, okay, we are super vulnerable. And it affected me. I mean, I felt vulnerable. Like I felt vulnerable, and I could see where, like, and I think that's been the case. Those tipping point moments have all been where I'm like, something's going to happen to me. Like I need to take care of, like there's a realization that I can't continue on as I am because it's impacting my health in some way.
Mm-hmm.
It's showing up. Like the impacts are unavoidable and showing up, and I can pretend that I can keep going. Like you have to, right? Like that's the piece about caregiving is the keeping going part. But sometimes you're faced with the real in your face signs that this is not like something's not okay. And I got to do something different.
But it's about your ability to realize that. And from your experience, the inability to realize that, what's the biggest obstacle to that? Is it guilt?
Normalization, like you're doing it for so long that it just starts to feel normal. Like this is, you lose complete perspective on what you're actually doing. And I actually don't think I'll really know how this has impacted me until after my mom's gone.
So is it like because of the normalization, we forget how to look after ourselves, or we forget that there's a choice for ourselves? Or is it just that there's no room for it to begin with? Because some people do set certain boundaries and are able to sort of come up with some element of self-care, and then many others aren't, and they feel like the odds are stacked against them. And nothing worse than hearing some pundit say, you need to take care of yourself. How can you do your job and if you're not taking care of yourself? It's like just too easy to say.
I think, yes, that whole put on your oxygen mask first kind of thing. I think it's funny. I had a discussion with a client about individual responsibility and systemic responsibility, because I don't want people to feel blamed in their caregiving journey. Like, you're doing the best job you can, and we're going to look at ways we can pull back some energy into you. But there's a whole lot of realities to this situation that can't be solved by a kale smoothie or a bubble bath.
Yeah.
And I don't want people to feel that they're to blame now. So digging into what makes it hard for people to set boundaries, or why self-care is harder for others, that gets into other parts of people's stories, right? Why is it hard for some people to rest? Why do people have expectations of themselves? Why do people struggle? I think there is a busyness factor and the doing factor in caregiving, that it's just like and there's creep. You know what? I think of caregiving creep. That's a good way to think about it. Like, you start doing something, and then, like, especially with in the situation of something like a neurodegenerative or cognitive decline situation, at first it's just like this. You're helping a little bit this way or that way. And then something shifts and you take on more. And then something shifts and you take on more and more and more and more and more. And it happens kind of slowly until suddenly I realize, 2 years ago, my mom was kind of she could start the laundry and do that. And now she's not doing that anymore. And I'm doing the whole thing.
Is that the beginning of the wear down sequence, that sort of first phase where you sort of you amass certain things, and then you hit that, oh man, I'm being worn down. There's something happening here. This is not as I thought it was going to be.
And there's, I think sometimes I do think because caregiving is about someone else, it's about focusing outside of you all the time, that you can just lose touch with how you feel and with it can become, one of the things that I thought about was that awful feeling of when you feel a bit robotic. You're just doing, but you're not really connecting, like, to yourself, or sometimes even maybe to the other person.
So as that robotic reality sort of sets in and you're entrenched in your caregiving role, often we hear about how a sense of loss, or a feeling like you're losing things in the process, sometimes yourself, sometimes other things, but, things that come to mind: sleep, losing patience, losing friendships, effects at work where you feel lost at work, or you're losing your connection with work, or even yourself. Like, what do you think are the first signs of those losses when you enter that robotic phase?
I think it's going to be, again, I can only speak to and this is true for all of this. This is just my lived experience, right? In my journey, what I've learned from learned from my clients too. But I think it's cumulative, and also kind of like attention, actually, concentration, the ability to focus on something when you are constantly divided attention all the time. You're at work, but you're, in my experience, at one period for years, phoning my mom to wake her up, or else she would sleep for hours and hours. Setting an alarm on my phone to do that between clients, and then having to set another alarm to make sure that I call back to make sure it happened, and then going over there at lunch, and then coming back and seeing the client. So you're split all the time. So concentration and chronically being behind, because crisis things come first, right? So you're being chronically behind in many, many parts of your life.
Yeah, and it's interesting. I mean, it's almost proof in principle of that, what was thought to be a time-honored skill of multitasking, but I think that's now been refuted. But I think in your words, you pretty much hit the nail on the head, that that the process just
Attention, it's
diffuses.
attention switching.
It really diffuses
It's
you.
yeah.
It diffuses your attention, and as you say, you just fall behind.
Mhm.
What about friendships and patience?
Mhm.
Like, does all of that
Yeah.
just sort of take a shelf as well because there's no room for that either?
I think that patience is I've thought a lot about patience in the last 10 years. I've thought to myself, why, literally, could someone explain to me, why is it so hard to hear somebody say the same thing 27 times in 5 minutes? Like, why is that difficult? Why can I not just why can that not just be okay?
Mm-hmm.
Because if it could just be okay, my journey would be a lot easier, right? Why is that so hard? Why is repetition, being asked the same question? I don't know. Like, it's an interesting question. Why is that so difficult? It is.
Why do you think?
And I haven't got any really good theories. I just know that it's true, that it is wearing and hard, and you learn how to be, like, Alzheimer's is learning how to be with someone that you love and be okay with it and be good with them, and you learn all these kinds of ways of spending time with them and doing things with them, but they take energy, and that's something that the longer you go, your creativity gets, like, there's a lot of creativity required in caring for someone with Alzheimer's, in my
Mhm.
experience. Creative problem solving, creative ways of being together, creative ways of finding how to make their life good, like help them create the life they want. Creativity goes away as fatigue sets in, and you just don't, like, it just gets, that part gets really hard. Exhaustion,
Mm-hmm. Complacence.
really. It's not complacence. It's just deep bone weary fatigue, and it's additive and cumulative over time, because what I used to say is, like, as my mom's needs increase, I'm not fresh. I'm like the furthest thing from fresh.
Right on.
It's the opposite. Like, it's like an inverse relationship, right? Her needs
Mhm.
increase, and my showing up over time, it impacts me more and more.
So, how do you create sort of? I'm trying to figure out where that leads to a tipping point, or if you're already, like, if the tipping point is actually a drawn out process. But how do you?
I think that's it. I think it's like you go down and you go up and you go down and you go up. Like, I think it's like,
And the
but I
sine
think
wave
it's
may get a little
all,
bit bigger, or the trough's a bit deeper, or maybe the peak's a little
that's what I
bit
was going to
less
say,
high,
or the
right?
angle is,
It's
yeah, like that's what I feel like, because I can think back and think of certain tipping points in the last 10 years where usually for me, they're just like hitting an emotional wall of, oh, like, I can't do this in this way anymore, but I still have to do it. So I got to figure out how to do it. Like, there's no getting off the ride, right?
how do you process your thoughts about the future in those moments then?
No, it's not great. like like I said, it's truly not. It's just not a place where I have to pull myself back from the edge. Like, the long-term future is really hard.
I
Yeah.
wonder if
It's
it's that sort of
yeah.
people that's saying the future is now, and maybe that's an important anchoring point, is that
Mhm.
staying in the now in those troubled times allows you to just sort of unload too much worrying about the future and trying to stay
Yeah.
now. Although, as you said, in your progressively depleted state, it remains a challenge.
Yeah. And I think one of the things I did was I 100% said this to myself, was I said, these are the good days. Okay. Like, for years and years and years, I would say, these are the good days,
Mhm.
because despite all of it, there were things that I could count them. I could say, my mom can still do this. My mom can still do this. Like, these are ways of reminding
Mhm.
myself, because there's, like, that anticipatory grief too, right? Like, that is woven into all of this as well. And you don't want to spend a lot of time there either.
Mhm.
I mean, when I say that, acknowledge it, allow it, but to not let it color everything.
Well, and letting yourself enjoy those good days. And that's almost a bit of an act of
Mhm.
self-compassion as well, towards yourself
Mhm.
in that journey, as opposed to, thinking yourself into a different corner. Did at one point in all of this, did that work ever become pure suffering? Or was there always sort of a beacon of light that you were able to carry?
There have been stretches where I would say I could feel in every fiber of my being that I didn't want to do this. Like, I just like every part, you have to do X or go or be there, do this or do that. And like every fiber of my being did not want to.
How did that show up? Was it
Now,
like one day where there it was? Or did you notice like you
no,
say every fiber, was there certain fibers first and then just everything just hit that pinnacle? Or is it actually just like almost like an on-off switch where you're just going and going, then suddenly you get that wall that hits you?
I think that I think that there is a kind of a lead up to it that I can kind of work my way around. And then it is more like partly when I don't have a choice. If you don't have a choice, and sometimes there have been no choices, right? No backup, no options, no other thing. So I have to you just have to do it. Like, it's so funny to say that out loud, but it's just, there's a truth to that. But then I think sometimes it was like the wall of like, and literally I can feel it in my stomach. I can feel it it's a physical sensation of like, I don't want to dread. I can't, I just like, I don't have it in me to do this thing. Luckily for me, it's not a place I stay.
Mm-hmm.
It's not a place I've stayed. It's a place I've been. It's a place sometimes I get to. But for me, I have had ways of pulling myself out.
That's huge though, because you're making a decision in that moment, the decision not to stay in that space. What fuels that decision? What informs the skills to be able to make that decision? Like realizing I'm here, I'm hitting the wall hard, but I'm choosing not to stay here. I'm sure there's some listeners out there who just love to just get a sense, okay, I'd really like to do that. How do we do that?
Well, I think the first part is when I think about self-compassion, I think about it. The first part is the acknowledging of the suffering, right? Like being able to literally hold yourself and say, this is just so painful and this is profoundly hard right now. And I'm feeling it like in this moment, like to really, really hold yourself and acknowledge it. Because that's the first, like that has to happen to be able to move away from it. Like you have to really own it. And so sometimes just to literally hand on heart, hand on belly, and acknowledge the suffering, like in the moment. And when I think about that, there are other profoundly painful moments different than that when you're caring for someone, caregiving. Like there's just these moments of like profound pain that you have to recognize them and honor them. They just are. That's the start.
What if this doesn't quite get you out of the gate? What are the next skills that you need to tap into when the stakes are higher?
Yep. Okay. You got to be able to hold two stories at the same time. And I think, you have to be able to hold, because there are always two stories. I could tell you the story of my caregiving, but I could also tell you the story of the other parts of my life and I have other parts of my life that are generative and life-giving and good. And you have to be able to hold two things at the same time. And it's actually kind of crazy making, right? How can something in your life be so all-consuming, so painful, so hard, and my kids are healthy and thriving and doing the things they're supposed to be doing, and that gives me tremendous pleasure to watch that kind of hope in life. Okay, I'm learning. I've got it's looking for I don't know if you know anything about polyvagal theory, but glimmers. The concept of glimmers, the idea of looking for glimmers are the opposite of triggers. So cultivating gratitude is actually, my mother's extremely grateful. So maybe there's like a genetic predisposition to gratitude because and she is still grateful. Okay. And appreciative. That's kind of she's very unusual in some ways, but in that regard, I think the gratitude, and it doesn't have to be big. In fact, the research on gratitude shows us that it's the searching for things to be grateful for that's actually where we get the kick. It's not in the what it is. It's the act of looking for the things. And so I think gratitude is part of it. Gratitude and appreciation, having other parts to your life, but you have to notice those things, right? And you have to be able to hold two things at the same time. The pain and the joy and the weird mix that life is. That's hard. That's actually really hard for people. That the story is never just one story.
Are there approaches to build those skills in handling both stories? Like, is this part of therapy to build those resources internally to be able to carry two stories and with a dab of gratitude and ability to be present in the moment, and hopefully that gratitude fuels an ability to enjoy the moment. Like, can that be learned? Because I'm sure people are dying. Like these are really foundational things. If you can create a galvanized ability, to use a term that we're using today, to keep two stories, your caregiving journey, as well as those parts of you that fuel you, not just as a caregiver, but fuel you as the person you always have been, there's something to be learned there.
Yeah, I think those things can be learned. Just like we can understanding who you are as a caregiver and what informs your caregiving and how you perceive it. You know, I could say I have struggled with this. Like sometimes I'm a person who can get pretty stuck in the way I think something should be, and I have pretty high standards. Ask my partner for everything. You know, like you have to learn how to dial it back, right? I remember a really wise colleague saying to me at one point, maybe you could take, and this is actually hard to even say out loud because it feels like a bit of a, maybe it's a betrayal or something, but she said to me, could you take just a little bit less good care of your mom and a little bit better care of yourself? Just a little. What would that look like? Loosening, right? That's a loosening question. Can I loosen how attached I am to the way things need to be for my mom in order to see that I'm a person in the story? And I think it took me some time. It took me some time in my journey it's an ongoing journey. It's not done. Like this is not a place you arrive at and suddenly you do this perfectly at all. You fall into the pits.
I remember.
But the getting out process, is what you and I are talking about. How do you fall in and get out?
Yeah. I think our talk with Jeanette Yates a while back, she said, just show yourself a little grace in the process. And that really resonated from that conversation. I could see where that has its place in this as well. You know, you have an interesting perspective as a therapist as well as an entrenched caregiver, but do you think the suffering that comes with caregiving is different compared to other forms of chronic stress or trauma that your clients might even come to you to talk about? Like, is this a category on its own?
That's such a good question, because people's lives are very rarely about singular things, right? Like a person doesn't come in with caregiving stress separate from other sources, other chronic stresses in their life and their trauma history. They're always all these things all mixed up together.
Correct.
So what I think is interesting is how one informs the other. You know what I think the difference and this is just me, when I think about chronic unremitting stress.
I want to hear what you have to say.
Well, it's sort of a simple answer, but like caregiving stress, the piece there is love for me, right? And that actually makes me feel a lot when I say that, because everything from my mom, dignity, quality of life, it's coming from a place of love. The chronic stress that you experience from work and other sources, it's just different. But makes the caregiving journey different. Makes it harder in some ways too. Harder to figure out how come what sometimes it feels like what's to care for myself means my mother suffering. And that's an interesting, but yeah, like some of the choices that I may have to make in the future, or they involve what might be better for me, but is not better for her. And I find that part really hard. How do I balance those things? I think that's different. So, but to your point about chronic stress in other areas, I think the physiological effects are very similar between chronic stress and caregiving stress. Like it looks really similar in terms of how it shows up, how people live it.
Cortisol up.
Exactly.
Sure.
Chronically hyperaroused nervous system, or flat, depending on their proclivities in that way, right? Sleep disturbances, all the typical, like that looks the same. And then there's so many flavors to to people's caregiving journeys. Like, it's really hard. That's why it's so important to realize this is just me, my experience. And I've sat with so many people that have, like, I know how hard this can be. And I have, yeah. So the trauma piece, as I said, is super interesting because it plays a huge part in how people move through this part of the journey. And that's some of the work that I do with clients, right? It's just trying to disentangle. People get into haves and shoulds. And I recognize this, right? I see myself in that. It has to be a certain way. It should be this. I don't have a choice. When people start feeling like they don't have choices, that's when we want to pause and kind of take a step back and look at it and think, there is a truth to some of that sometimes. Okay, there 100% is a truth. And this is the and story, right? And there can also be places where we can play with that a little bit. And I think about pulling back energy into people. You're giving out energy. What are ways that we can disentangle? What things are, the prioritization is a big deal. Everything starts to feel like a crisis when you're in that mode of do, solve, fix problems all the time. It starts to feel like you're always in crisis mode. And the space to step back from that and figure out, is this truly a crisis? What is a crisis? Now, having said that, there are a lot of things when you're caring for someone with Alzheimer's that they don't look like a crisis from the outside, but they literally cause a crisis. Like something as simple as Rogers replaces my mother's phone with a phone she has never seen before, a TV switcher. I thought that was going to be the thing that would push my mom into long-term care because she couldn't identify the object. She couldn't. So I spent like 2 days trying to figure out how I was going to support my mom because she has to be able to use a phone, right? For safety. Like if she can't make a phone call, we are in some trouble, right? And it took days of time to figure out how many instructions could I write and where could I put them and how could it's not a crisis, but that was a crisis.
And reinforcement and repetition. And yes, of course, it's a new
learning. And there is no
learning.
laying down of new memories, right? There is no laying down of new memories at a certain stage in Alzheimer's. So you're trying to, like, it's a whole, memory would be another conversation too. It's really interesting. But at any rate, that's an example of it sounds really stupid, right? How could a phone be a crisis? Well,
you mentioned how chronic stress, trauma, and caregiving suffering are kind of all intertwined because everything gets brought to the table. But do you think the suffering that comes with intense caregiving is a kind of suffering that only another caregiver can understand?
Yes and no. I think that I have a few people in my life, a small number of people who truly get it. And they have told me how what they do has been altered by watching this experience with me, what they've learned from that. But that's like a person the people in my life that are deeply in my life. Yes, I think that it is very lonely. It's a very lonely process, caregiving, very lonely. So yes, I think only people who have been through it have a different ability to connect and understand. And again, I think it's specific, like the journey with Alzheimer's versus, caring for a child with a disability into adulthood. That's a different experience.
Absolutely.
Your position related to the person, all of those things will.
The baseline relationship, for sure. It just keeps resonating that we're seeing, and to use North American society as an example, but we see it, I think it's happening across the world. Caregiving is up there with death and taxes. If we're not going to be cared for, we will be caregivers in some capacity or not. Yeah. But do you think society needs to relook at approaches to actually training the next generation of family caregivers? And that, I always allude to this, and I'm always curious to know what people think, but we do, many people do a marriage prep course, but maybe there's a caregiving prep course that we need to be aware of certain thoughts and certain conversations we need to have at a certain point in life. Maybe it'll be 5 or 10 years before we have a chance of being a caregiver, but something that allows us to be ready for it, or maybe to sort of take an inventory of things that linger, which if we healed from would make us better prepared for the next phases of our life. And I'm always curious to know what experts in the field like yourself think about that.
I went off in a little mental tangent about something when you were talking. So I'll come back to answering your question, I think. But what I was thinking about was how incredibly invisible caregiving is. And that's something that I've struggled with.
That's well
The silent,
described. The
it's invisible.
invisibility of caregiving.
Oh, it's invisible. And there's so much silent suffering.
Well, it's invisibility in the face of quiet expectations by the system.
And that you continue to do all of the function in all the parts of your life with there isn't really any recognition, right? There is no recognition for it or acknowledgement, or there's a high cost, but no recognition. And yeah, like I look at, I talk about middle-aged women because I just look at middle-aged women and I look at the load that they're carrying, right? And I assume that I have some understanding of all of the things that are going on there. I don't know. Yeah, the silent suffering strikes me, the invisibility of it, the lack of recognition, the fact that I like I've said this to a colleague of mine a few times. I've said the support system that my mom has saved the healthcare system enormous amounts of money by preventing her from being a frequent flyer through the hospital system, right? The prevention of the oversight, all of that, like the amount of resources that have been saved by the work, by the work and figuring out what that work is. There are so many things I didn't see coming in this process. And like, I would say I'm a forethought person, but there's so many things I didn't see coming in terms of what this would mean and look like. And
well, there's a big call out, and we're starting to see it emerge, and that this invisibility and the indirect costs that are saved by, or the direct costs that are saved by the conveniently placed indirect caregiving, if you will, because it's kind of invisible, as you say. It's not on the books. At least not the system's books. It's on your own personal books, but it's not on the system's books. That needs to be recognized. And we are seeing in different states across the U.S. where tax credits or some sort of stipends for caregivers or family caregivers are coming to the forefront, where the family caregiving leave is now entering the workplace as a discussion point for strategies for retention of workers by acknowledging the social realities that we're all facing in our society.
How many people leave the workforce at the peak of their career?
Or don't contribute to the retirement funds because they're pocketing the extra costs of caregiving for their loved one. Actual loss of productivity or less hours on the clock than usual at work. So there's a lot going on here, and I think it'll be very interesting 5 to 10 years to come, and to see where this goes, because with what you describe, and if collectively that's being described, and that becomes a voice, and a loud voice, hopefully heard. As a therapist, you became a caregiver over this period, and you've continued to work in the field. You've continued to learn over your career trajectory. Has your training as a psychotherapist and your experience as a psychotherapist in any way protected you from the darkest parts of the caregiving journey when you look back?
Maybe. I mean, I think that I think I do it differently because, I feel like for me, being a therapist isn't just what you do, it's who you are, right? Like it's and you use yourself in your work. And I think that because of that, sometimes you're able to see yourself, hold yourself separate I think about all the skills and learning about being with yourself and managing difficulty and change and transition and all the things that I've spent 30 years talking to clients about. And it's all here. It's interesting. It's interesting now to be taking my experience of this and translating it into my work with clients. It's interesting. Yeah. We didn't talk about COVID, but COVID was really something. COVID was overnight, no supports and resources for people, right? And so from having to being the only support in my case, me and my sibling, the only support for my mother. No other things, no other resources, no other, everybody's at home. The kids are home. Your job's turned upside down overnight. Like in terms of the method and how we're doing it, and mental health stuff was like, and then on top of that, trying to manage COVID was really something in that process.
That must have just been something exponential, like almost undescribable once you have a working mechanism in place to sort of keep all the balls in the air, then all of a sudden, overnight, everything comes crashing in.
Overnight. But I think that's the journey with Alzheimer's is you go along and you have maybe like a little time where things are kind of semi-stable, and then something changes, and then something changes. Like it's a shifting sands kind of moving. So how do you prepare for that? How do you prepare people to be caregivers? Can you prepare people? Everyone, you say everyone's going to have a shot at it, but the truth is that that's not true. Like, think about all the families where some people decide that that's not their job. Not everyone shows up to care.
You're right.
Like at all. And and again, people's family dynamics and all of that play into that as well. I have a little list of things that I mentally think these are things that I will do in order to prepare myself for like things. I don't want to call it things I won't do to my kids, but let's call it that. Like a list of, this is smart. By this age, I will decide this. I will make these decisions. I will write them down. I will tell them. I will have a candid conversation.
Well, I remember my parents being caregivers for 4 senior relatives, my dad mostly,
Wow.
and one of them outlived him. And I always remember sort of saying, as a young person in my 20s, you better not do that to me one day. Like, just remember what you're learning, and I sympathize with you. But if you do that to me, that's going to be a no-go. But, it does bring about, when we're facing these challenges and these dark moments, like there are dark thoughts that are triggered among caregivers, and they may have to bury them and just hide them away because there's so much guilt and shame. When you look back over the stories, and this is all about storytelling, what do you think those darkest thoughts that people are compelled to just hide and keep buried?
Well, one thing is, I don't know how dark this is, but I think that a lot of caregivers have escape fantasies.
Mm-hmm.
And it's just a tell, right? It's a tell that about needs, that what's happening is so intolerable that it feels like you need to get out of it, that you need to get away, and you're desperate to get away. And I think there are a lot of people in caregiving roles who feel that desperation to just have. I know the difference between being in my life here and then when I'm fortunate enough to be able to do something like go to a conference or something, and the amount of energy is so interesting. Like the connection to energy and the being able to shed for a little while a role that you play that is so like, and you often don't realize what it's costing you until you get away from it. Some people never get to get away.
Yeah.
But you realize it's not cognitive. It's like a physical feeling of what it's like to have a true break, like to have some distance where you're far enough away that someone else has got to solve the problem or deal with the crisis or whatever.
That is huge.
But it is huge, and that's when you can realize. I think sometimes people describe feeling kind of dead inside, or they feel kind of I think lots of people think about the end, right? Like this will end when the person's gone. And for some people that feels, like I don't wish them gone, but I wish the end to this suffering. And, it's very complex.
Mm-hmm. I've heard some caregivers say that weekend away is followed by soon to evolve dread of coming back.
Oh, I
didn't hear that in you, though. You sort of sounded like this was quite rejuvenating. Is there dread too in the return?
I have 100% had ambivalence about coming home. Yeah, for sure.
So,
but not because of. But to say that is to hold a couple of truths here. Only about one aspect of my life, not about the all the other parts of my life that are good and generative. And so you have to hold those at the same time.
You can imagine the compounding effects when you don't have those other parts of your life that that generate positive energy.
Yeah.
And yet
Yeah.
those individuals are called and often have no choice of being caregivers either. And they're among the many who are also trying to work and also trying to
Yes.
carry on a household and a budget and everything else. You said,
Yes, like no support, like that's why at the very beginning you asked about capacity, right?
Mhm.
Like where do you find support? Where do you feel understood? Who are the people that get what you're going through? Do you have fun in your life? Do you have something? I've realized this is actually as a strategy, something I've realized is so, so important. Okay, do you have something that you do in your life that takes up all of your mental space? It could be playing a sport, it could be playing board games, but it takes up all of your mental space, because the relief sometimes from caregiving is when the thoughts stop.
Mhm.
When you're not flipping from thing to thing to thing and problem solving and all that, and you focus, right? It's like a mindfulness activity in a sense.
Mhm.
Anything where our attention becomes like focal, and we notice when our attention wanders and we bring it back. That's a mindfulness.
Kind of the basis of meditation, right?
Exactly. So it can be a sport, because as soon as you're doing it and you get out of it, you recognize it, you come back to it. But that experience of focusing in, and that is actually extremely important for truly having a break when you actually are not literally somewhere else.
Mhm.
So for some people, it could be art, anything that takes up space where you cannot think, or when you learn when your mind wanders and you bring it back. That's extremely important.
A hugely valuable skill, and one that you need to practice. But I think with the right
Mhm.
motivation and belief in the return on the investment, you can develop. And certainly it could be an important part of that toolkit. Something you mentioned earlier really struck me when you spoke about love.
Mhm.
And as a caregiver, how do you square love with feelings of anger, resentment, and maybe even disgust during their caregiver journey? It's a delicate balancing act, or a delicate conflict,
Mhm.
but it's one that's potentially real. How have you coped with it, and what would you advise other caregivers experiencing that?
That it's normal, right? That the full range of human feelings in a complicated relationship like that, that it's super normal. That there's nothing that it doesn't actually, feelings are feelings, right? They come and they go. They don't actually, and thoughts, right? They don't represent reality. They represent a moment. And like all of them, they're going to come and go. How you feel in the morning isn't how you feel at night. And it's normal that under a set of enduring, impossible conditions,
Mm-hmm.
that it makes sense. And that that you can feel both things, that you can have both parts. You can both resent someone and love them. You can resent someone and have compassion. They can all be there. Sometimes one is closer to the surface, but they're all part of the experience. And yeah.
What's it like when you enter that stage where caregiving just sounds so grossly unfair? Like you're losing your prime years, yet the person who you're looking after got a chance to have their prime years, and now they no longer even remember who you are.
No, my mom still remembers who I am, so you'll have to ask me when I get there about that part.
Mm.
But
I
I
guess
think it's
we can
funny. I think I've realized that part of the problem with this is expectations,
Mhm.
right? Expectations and acceptance. And I don't think that's a place you arrive at. I think that's a journey. And it's something that I think I struggle with in this experience, which is part of the problem is believing that you get certain things in a certain way in your life, that being 50 means, or 55 means, that life should look like this. Okay. And the truth is, I can actually look around and find there are other examples. I'm not the only person doing this.
Mhm.
Sometimes it feels like that, right? Because I've told you it feels really lonely
Yeah.
and poorly understood and invisible, and that's really hard. But if I step back from it, I know that there are other people having this experience. I know that I'm not alone. But I have to I can, the suffering comes from the non-acceptance. And like I said, this isn't something, I think this is something I try to do, right? Which is kind of, we talked about this at the beginning. It's about acceptance and about looking for the ways that I can find ways to have the pieces that I want in some way in my life, so that I don't have to sit in that place of I'm losing my life. My dad passed away in my 20s from from ALS. And that was a very important moment about living your life, not waiting to do everything. Okay. Like not waiting until not assuming that you're going to have your partner when you're 70, or have your partner, or to have experiences sooner, and to try to not wait for everything. And I think that experience really changed how I felt about trying to create what you need in the now as much as you can, little pieces here and there, and then recognizing them, right? Like acknowledging them.
And maybe celebrating them and giving yourself a pat on the back that you were actually able to use that lens, right? Because I think if there's no one else around to reinforce, at least you can reinforce yourself and give yourself a little bit of directed encouragement. But a couple of times now, the loneliness and the sense of being alone on the journey as your identity changes has come up. What have been the sources of community for you? Are there organizations that you've become involved in, or that have benefited from you, or you've benefited from? A lot of people say just the advent of really valuable social media resources of individuals with shared experiences who just nurture each other collectively are becoming important tools for dementia caregivers to tap into, so that they're in a world that some people argue is a little bit leaning towards toxic individualism. We can still find community in our shared journey.
Yeah, and I definitely think that there are times when, like, TikTok puts things into words for people, reaches people. It's interesting, right? It does reach people's experience. For me, my community of support, my relationships, I haven't like, for example, been in a caregiver support group or anything like that. I honestly, part of it is time and space. Like, to do something additional in that regard hasn't been part of my experience. My support has come from the people, my close people in my life, whether those are my like work colleagues, dear friends. That's where it's been, and some surprising places actually in my church community. Not surprising, but I often find, like, I had a really dear friend there who he was caring for his wife, and he and I always had a good connection. Oh gosh, he passed away last year. He was 80 something, but we used to talk about things together. He understood, so you find support in kind of in different places. I just try to learn everything I could and rely on the people that are my close circle, really.
Well, that common language and shared experience, their lived experience is truly valuable.
You also kind of don't want to be a downer. It's a really interesting thing about how you hold this out in the world. Like, how do you, when something is this enormous thing that you are carrying around all the time and it's running your life, how do you hold that in, like, in regular spaces, like at work, or someone says, how are you doing, or whatever? Like, you're kind of always, you got to think about where does that sit with you? And I think that's something I've struggled with too. Like, because I think the answer for me is you think about what you are hoping for back when you share. And that's something actually I talk about with clients, is about sharing right now when you're vulnerable and you're exhausted and you're in this space. You don't want to give something to somebody who's not going to hold it gently. So sometimes keeping it, not saying, can be an act of self-care. And then we have to think about, who are the people that can hear you? Who are the people that can actually are going to give you back something that you need and can be part of your journey? Who can you let in? Who makes sense to? But that can be a whole process of itself, right? Of trying to figure out who and where. Because when you're exhausted and somebody doesn't get it, that sucks.
And you feel that reflection back on you, and it's an uncomfortable spot. short of falling to the default of and saying I'm fine all the time, which can be a source of problems also.
Yeah.
We're very cognizant of moral injury these days in the healthcare domains, in a lot of aspects of society. As a caregiver for your mom, have you faced decisions where you ultimately had to make a decision which you wish you didn't have to, but it's all you could accomplish? And was there some moral injury that you've ever experienced in having to make decisions like that?
I think I'm still working on that one, actually, in some parts of that. But what I will say is that possibly among the really most difficult parts of this journey are looking at what is out there in terms of support systems, and it is not acceptable. The quality of the care, it's not acceptable. What is there?
The whole value system, right? It's ironic that the people we count on the most are very undervalued in terms of their salary scale and their remuneration, and that the help that society needs, we're choosing to undercut those individuals, yet expecting high value return on the investment, which is just plain incongruous, but also not fair. And it's soul sucking. Good caregiving, professional or non-professional, is very important and special work. And it takes a true dedication of self and compassion to the person you're caring for, even if you're actually on payroll for that.
Yeah. And the medical system is not yet dementia friendly. It's not dementia educated. Like, that's my experience is in so many different settings. Like, I always joke I could have a secondary job telling other people how to do their jobs.
How do you fix that?
Training people to how to, like, for example, I will not talk about my mother in front of my mother. You don't do it. It's not okay. If you need to have a conversation with me separately, let's have a conversation separately, but we won't talk about my mother, who is aware.
Mm-hmm.
It's not respectful. Also, if you know someone's had dementia for 10 years, you don't assume that they're a reliable narrator. Because that's a waste of time too.
Mm-hmm.
So there's some theater in there that is really frustrating. There is some lack of awareness. The most frustrating part is people offering you medical solutions that are wholly impossible to enact. That don't ask the question about, does this person live alone? Are you there with them 24 hours a day? Do they have, because how is this intervention going to happen in this scenario? And there is very little, there's never a question about, like, I've been to many different kinds of medical scenarios with my mom, and nobody ever asks an intelligent question about how is this going to happen? If, like, you have low blood pressure, every time you stand up, I want you to squeeze and tense your quads. Okay. That's going to help you to not have the dizziness when you stand up. Bye. How's that going to work? Right? Or I'm going to put this entire thing on so that to do like a halter monitor thing, all the things. What is going to happen? It is going to get torn off, packed up in the little bag and put on the thing.
Mm-hmm.
It's not going to happen. If it needs to happen, then you need to say, this is so important that you need to be with this person for 24 hours straight while this is happening, with your hand on there to keep them from taking it off, if it's that important.
I wanted to give you an opportunity before I say thank you for your openness and your honesty today and sharing your story with us, but also sharing a very unique experience and perspective. But let's hear a call to action. If you had a choice of an important call to action for caregivers, but also for maybe society at large, what would they be?
Oh, gosh.
You can pick many if you'd like.
No, I'm just thinking about, I think I want anybody else. I think to other caregivers, I think I just wish I wish gentleness and support and finding people who understand you and to not feel so alone in the journey, because that is the thing that buffers. That is probably the most important thing to me that has buffered me through my journey, is having people who get it around me and having support. And I wish that deeply, and that the full range of everything you feel is normal. Like it's just normal. Like you're a human being and under extreme, enduring, suffering, difficulty, and it's all normal, like how you feel. No need to add extra burden by guilting, And yet it's hard. Like, and I understand that too. Like, I understand that too. It's not something, we're not perfect. I don't know. And then I would like to dementia educate every single, who could have saved me hours and hours of time and frustration when I think about the time I've put in, the time that has been sucked up by solving problems created by solutions offered to me by the medical system, and people not working together and making assumptions of like just so little care in that system. Even within and more money. I want more money for caregivers. Pay them properly. Pay them what their work is worth. Find a way to recognize the invisible work that's happening by all the caregivers doing all this silent work. Find a way to recognize that.
I hear you loud and clear. Susan, thanks so much for being here today. It was a pleasure speaking to you. And again, thanks for putting it all on the table. You have so much to offer and so much perspective. Folks, that wraps up another episode of the Caregivers Podcast. I'm your host, Dr. Mark. We'll see you again next week. And throw us a line, throw us a comment. We're interested to hear what you have to say. And if you want to hear more or less about different topics, put it in the comments, direct message us. We're responsive because this is your podcast. Thanks, and we'll see you soon. Before we wrap up, I wanted to remind you of something important. The conversations you hear on this podcast are here to inform, to support, to spark reflection. They're not a substitute for professional medical advice, care, therapy, or crisis services. Listening to this podcast does not create a doctor-patient or caregiver-client relationship between us. If you're facing a medical concern, health challenge, a mental health challenge, or a caregiving situation that needs guidance, I encourage you to reach out to a qualified professional who knows your story. If you're ever in crisis, please don't wait. Call your local emergency number or recognize crisis hotline right away. You deserve real-time help and support. The views you hear on this show, whether from me or my guests, are our own. They don't necessarily reflect any organizations we work with, or are part of, or have worked with, or been part of in the past. This podcast is an independent production. It's not tied to any hospital, university, or healthcare system. Thank you for being here, for listening, and most of all, for taking the time to care for yourself while you continue to care for others. I look forward to hearing from you.